Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to talk about the king and how the king moves. As you can see on the diagram on the screen here in front of you, the king can basically move to any square that he can see. So these squares right here are the squares that he can move. Now the king, what we can say about the king is that the king is absolutely the most important piece on the chessboard. Because the whole goal of the chess game is to checkmate the king. So if the king is checkmated, that means the king is no longer able to do anything. The game basically ends. So the king needs to be protected at all costs. For that reason, the king is going to be very limited in terms of what it will do for most of the game. And as you can see by the arrows and the squares, the king, it's not going to be much help in the opening phases of the game or in the middle phases of the game because it can only move one square at a time. And even though it can only move one square at a time, in a way, it's kind of like the queen in the sense that it can go almost anywhere on the board, and it can move like a rook, it can move like a bishop, it can move like a pawn. The only difference is, unlike a rook or a bishop or even a pawn on its first move, the king can only move one square at a time, but it can move one square at a time in any direction on any color. So it can move horizontally, it can move diagonally, it can move laterally. And so for that reason, when there are less pieces on the board, the king is a very, very powerful piece. So let's look at the starting position of the game. You can see like all of the pieces that we discussed that need something to happen before the game can really get underway. The rook, the knight, the bishops, the queen, things need to happen for most of these pieces to get to reach their full potential, all except for the knight. Usually one of these pawns has to move one or two squares forward. The king, on the other hand, doesn't worry about any of that because the king is going to stay along this back rank for most of the game. And so in later videos, we're going to talk about how do we get the king to safety so the king is not vulnerable by staying in this kind of cluster of squares that you see here. We don't want the king there. We want, if possible, we want the king like on this square or maybe over here somewhere or tucked into a corner at some point in the game. So let's just clear the board for a second and talk about what happens with the king in terms of its ability to move. Now, I should say, just like I've said in other videos, everything that I'm talking about as it relates to the light square pieces, which generally is how the board is oriented when we start an online game, black's position is exactly the same. The king starts out on the opposite color of its own color. So the white king starts out on a dark square. The king, when it's its turn to move, and if it was going to move, it can only move one square at a time. So the king, assuming there were no other pieces near it, on its turn, can move there, or it 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 can move there. Now, the king's scope can be limited pretty easily because if the queen was here and if there was a bishop here, now the king only has these squares that it can move to, right? You add a pawn there, and suddenly the king only has this square, this square. You add another pawn, and now we look at the starting position of the game. The king is pretty locked down. It can't really go anywhere. So the king can capture, though. So if the king was under attack somehow, oops, I'm not sure what's going on here. If the king was under attack, let's say we clear the board and we add the king to the board. Let's say it was an end game, and there was another king on the board, and maybe there was a rook on the board, and maybe both sides had a rook, and maybe somehow there was a dark square pawn there. The king can capture that pawn. So if anything from the opponent is on a square that is touching the king, technically the king can capture it. So a pawn here, a pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, the king can capture it. It can move in any direction. It can go there, it can go there, it can go there, it can go there. Even if it was a rook that was sitting here, even though the rook is a big, bad, powerful piece, the king can capture it. What if it was a queen that was there? Can the king capture a queen? Absolutely. Any opposing piece that is on a square that the king can touch, the king can capture it. Now, one thing we do have to, we're not going to get into tactics yet, but there are some advantages for the king being able to move out into the center of the board. But there are also some disadvantages, particularly when you see lineups like this. Because remember, we talked about bishops and how strong bishops are. Bishops can threaten the king, and by through X-ray can also be threatening this rook. Because if the king ever moves away, the bishop can capture the rook. So because the king cannot capture, the way here's where we are, and we had a rook here, right? So the king cannot capture that piece because it cannot travel up these squares to get to that piece. The king is forced to move, and so therefore it leaves that piece vulnerable. If this let's say the king was here and this was a queen instead, right? And let's say black moves here, attacking that rook. Well, the queen can just go up and capture it. And then, of course, the king can capture the queen. And now, basically, the game is lost for black. Okay, it's going to be a lost game for black eventually. It'll take a while, but it's a lost game for black. All right. So that's all I want to say about the king. The king is a very powerful piece, but at the starting of the game, he also needs something to happen for it to reach his full potential. And his full potential is not going to take full effect until we get to the later parts of the game. We're talking about end game stuff. And then as the game gets towards the end game, the king becomes a very, very powerful piece. Because as you can see, or as I showed before, the king can move in any direction. And the king will be a good supporter of pawns, of rooks, anytime the game gets close to the end. All right, so that's all I want to say about the king. Like always, if you like this video, like and subscribe to my channel. Write any comments in the comment section below if there's anything I left out, if there's anything you'd like me to add. And I'd be glad to add them in future videos, or even remake this video if I made any major errors or blunders. That's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. Talk to you later.